Taxation is theft. My only request of the people who see this video is that they dispassionately consider the ideas I'm going to put forth here and hopefully at least recognize that it's very serious business when politicians and special interest groups and people in general petition the government to increase taxes to pay for whatever program that they want to fund. Because usually they're trying to fix some sort of complex social issue that Americans face, but throwing money at it is usually not the best way to go about addressing such issues. So there are two different ways that people come to the conclusion that taxation is theft, and I'll run through them here with you real quick. The first one is that when you look at different human interactions, the most important element that seems to occur is that of consent. So the difference between sex and rape is consent. The difference between a boxing match and assault is consent. And the difference between charity or lending and theft is consent. And so you might be asking yourself, well, what does that have to do with taxation? I'll tell you. So imagine if I decided to not pay taxes for the war on drugs. Let's say that I find that highly immoral and I don't support the government in its efforts to suppress drug use because I feel it's destructive, immoral, and hurts more people than it helps. So let's say I crunch the numbers and I find out X number of dollars from my taxes every year goes to pay for the war on drugs. And I decide to abstain from paying those taxes. When the government finds out, first they'll send me a letter asking me to pay up. When I ignore that, they will send me a little bit stronger worded letter and possibly some extra fines requesting that I pay the money. And when I ignore that, after enough time has passed, they will send armed individuals to collect either my money or my body so that they can put it in jail and, deprive me of my freedom of movement. So in that scenario, consent does not come into play. It is completely removed from the interaction. Because in order to have consent, you have to have the choice of opting out, of abstaining from whatever action is taking place. And as I just explained, the interaction between individuals and the government when it comes to taxation, there is no choice. So there's no room for consent to exist. And so even if an individual pays their taxes when the government requests it of them, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're consenting, because if they chose not to, they would be forced to in the end. Some people might think that that's an extreme thought process to go through. But if you think about it, when we talk about morality and what's right and what's wrong, we want those concepts to be as consistent as possible, because if they're not, then they become arbitrary and they become flexible to the point where at least there's a threat to where these concepts can become so flexible that they can be abused. So yes, when we consider our relationship with the government, consent is still a very, very important element to consider. The second thought process that people go through to conclude that taxation is theft is to start small and then scale up to basically the size of government when it comes to funding programs that you want. So if I decide that there's a charity that I would like to have funded because I believe they do good things, I could give them my money, right? That's moral. But now what if I decide to come to you and say, hey, there's a charity that does really good stuff and it's really important. I want you to give them money. And if you don't, I will take that money from you and give it to them. So that's immoral, right? If you say, hey, no, I don't want to give money to that charity. I'm giving it somewhere else, or I'm using it for this, or for whatever else. But I still take it from you by force. That's theft, right? That's immoral. Okay, well then what about if I go around the neighborhood and grab a couple more people and come by your house and say, hey, all of us believe that this charity is really important. We want your money so that we can give it to this charity. If we take it by force, still immoral, right? Still wrong. So what if I grab or get the consent of most of the people in my state and say, hey, most of us have voted. We've determined that we want to take your money and other people's money to give to this charity. Still theft, right? If you don't consent and we take your money and give it, then it's theft. Well, then I think you can see where I'm going, right? So when it comes to government, the only two things that make us think that it's moral or just or okay for the government to take taxes from us to pay for things that it wants is that it's enough people and they all agree to the same thing, right? So if we want to be consistent and universal in our morals and our principles, well then taking money from an individual without their consent, whether it's one person, whether it's 10 people, or whether it's a whole state of people deciding that they want to do it, it's all immoral. We all want to be very consistent in these ideas, or else they are very susceptible to abuse. I've heard people counter this argument saying things like, oh, well, there's a social contract, or there are public goods that need to be funded, or it's the price of living in a civilized society and whatnot. And I reject all of those ideas, and the arguments against those are long enough to where I'll make individual videos for each of those things. But at its root, I think it's very important to, when we've determined what's right and what's wrong, to make sure that they are as universal as possible. Because if they're not, if we decide that if enough people agree, or if a politician does it, well, then these are making exceptions to, the very fabric of our morality and what we think is right and wrong. And if we're not careful, we can be duped into some severe cognitive dissonance. And I think most of us, maybe just to hit this home, a final example, I'm sure everyone watching this video can think of a program or a thing that the government does that they don't like, that they find immoral, and that they would rather not be funded. So at the very least, at least consider that we all have things that the government funds that we don't like. Is it right and proper for the government to force us to pay for these things? Are our moral values and foundations so weak that we're going to allow a group of people to vote to make us nullify our values and our morals? And I think that is one of the most powerful arguments I can think of to at least curtail the government's ability to take money from us and to fund different programs. I hope that stirred a little bit of thought and made sense to everyone out there. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.